And we come today to Jeremiah chapter 18, in which I've entitled this section. We're going to study chapters 18 and 19. I know you think about that and say, well, that's 2 chapters. How are you going to get through that? I'm going to try my best. But the good news is there is a handout in the back that has the information. So if I do not get to everything that I want to cover, the information is there. So you could look over and see even more that's there. Jeremiah chapter 18 and 19 are lumped together because they use similar or the same illustration in 2 different themes. How many of you are familiar with someone known as a potter? Or how many of you have ever seen a flower pot? Somebody had to make that flower pot, didn't they? And it's interesting how we can find things like that in our Bibles. Illustration that's so common, that's commonly used. And God's going to use this in chapter 18 and chapter 19 with Jeremiah to illustrate something. And this gives us a thought about God. God is the potter, and we are the clay. In fact, our song of encouragement this morning is going to be, "Have thine own way, Lord." And in that song, the very first line, it says, "Thou art the potter, and I am the clay. Mold me and make me after thy will, while I am yielding is still," something of that nature. And that imagery comes right from Jeremiah 18 and 19. And God's going to use this illustration of a potter and the clay pot to illustrate something, not only to Jeremiah, but to the people. So we find in Jeremiah chapter 18, we find verses 1 through 6 can be outlined in chapter 18 this way. The potter's lesson. God shapes his people. There's a command to go, verses 1 to 2. The word which came to Jeremiah from Yahweh, saying, "Arise and go down to the potter's house," or potter's shop, "and there I will make you hear my word." So he's instructed Jeremiah, go down to the local potter's place. I want you to go there, and I'm going to give you a message there. So Jeremiah goes. He goes, verses 3 and 4. "Then I went down to the potter's house, and behold, he was making something on the wheel." Have you ever seen someone make a flower pot or a pot? I tried to find a video that would, and I don't need the sound, but I tried to find a short video that would show of how someone makes a flower pot. I found this video. It illustrates, of course, ignore the first part of it, but notice this, and how it's interesting how they make this. Imagine Jeremiah, and you go to a shop and you see somebody making this. That thing that's spinning around, that's the potter's wheel. And so they make bowls and different things out of this clay. And God's going to use an illustration as Jeremiah goes to this potter's shop. And he's going to use this to demonstrate the children of Israel and how they were intended to be God's clay. But instead of allowing God to shape their lives, Israel is like the stiff clay that hardens and breaks. And so we'll see that as we go through this chapter 19 as well. Think about this. He says, "I went down to the potter's house, and behold, he was making something on the wheel. But the vessel that he was making of clay was ruined in the hand of the potter." So notice what it says. What happens to a ruined piece of clay? Here's what he does. He doesn't discard it. He doesn't say, throw that away, let's get some more. There might be an occasion where he might have to do that, but he doesn't do that here. It says in the text, he was making something on the wheel. Behold, the vessel of clay was ruined in the hand of the potter, so he turned around and made it into another vessel. He took that broken piece, or the messed up portion, and he tried again. He redid that. He used that same clay, and he's making another one. He makes another vessel according to what was right in the eyes of the potter to make. So now, as God has said, we'll find in verse 5, Remember, God told Jeremiah, you go to that potter's house or potter's shop, and I'm going to give you a message there. Well, here it is. Then the word of Yahweh came to me, saying, Can I not, O house of Israel? Right here, God is using this illustration. God is giving Jeremiah a real-life illustration that he could see right there. He said, O house of, and he uses this to tell Israel, O house of Israel, deal with you, can I not, O house of Israel, deal with you as this potter does? God is calling on his people, can I not make you and mold you and how I want you to be? Can I not do that? But notice this, declares Yahweh, behold, like the clay in the potter's hand, so are you in my hand, O house of Israel. We are the work of the hands of the potter that is illustrated here by being God. God is the potter and mankind being the clay. Here in context, talking about the house of Israel, the house of Judah. They're God's masterpiece. God wants to form them and make them into something. And he says, at one moment I might speak concerning a nation or concerning a kingdom to uproot it, to tear down, or to make it perish. But if that nation against which I have spoken turns from its evil, I will relent concerning the calamity or the destruction I plan to do against it. Notice that. There's something called the law of sowing and reaping. And there's something that says here. In other words, God plans what to do to it. And why does he plan evil for this? Because of their evil. In other words, if you reap evil, if you sow to the flesh, you'll reap corruption. You'll reap destruction. But God says, I don't want to give you that. If you repent, I'll turn from my evil life. I was going to do it. I'll turn from that. And so he gives that illustration. I can do that. If you turn from its evil, I will relent. Now, what's the message of Jeremiah to the people of Israel? Over and over again, he has called his people to come back, to come back and leave those idols that they have been messing with. Leave the idols that's making in the hands of men and come back to God. And over again, God has said, if you'll come back, I won't punish you. I won't send you into this. But as God has already illustrated to Jeremiah, you're going to speak this, they're not going to hear you. And because they wouldn't hear the message of Jeremiah, even though he gave the warning and he spoke all that God had said to him to speak, they refused to listen. We can find in the same context that's what's going to happen. But God has the right to mold his people how he wants. But the problem is are we going to be like the clay that's easy for the potter to mold and to shape? I think about Romans 8. It talks about being conformed to the image of God's Son, Jesus. Are we going to allow ourselves to be conformed to Jesus and allow God, as the master potter, as the almighty potter, to shape us? Here's something to think about. You may be like that broken piece of pottery as he's shaping. God can take that same shape and he can still use that. He's done that throughout history. Think about, is Jeremiah a perfect man? No. But God uses Jeremiah as his prophet. Was King David, a perfect man? No, but he uses David as his king. Look at all the people that God used. How many of them were as perfect as Jesus Christ? The answer is none of them. But yet God could take broken pots. God can take pottery that is messed up, and he can reuse it, reshape it, and rebuild it. That's the power of God. The thing is are we, the clay, are going to allow the potter to shape us? Or are we going to be stubborn and hardened and say no and break and continue to break until we become utterly useless? Such as that's the picture of the case of judgment. At that point, which we have rejected God, we have become useless. At that point, he cannot fix us. There comes everlasting destruction because we failed to allow God to mold us. And that's the overarching theme throughout these two chapters. Is God being the potter and man being the clay? Are we going to allow God to shape us the way he needs to shape us? Or are we going to rebel like the house of Israel? And again, he says, on the opposite spectrum. Or another moment, I might speak concerning a nation or concerning a kingdom to build up or to plant it. But if it does evil in my sight by not listening to my voice, then I will relent concerning the good which I promised to do good to it. So it's vice versa. It works both ways. God plans for a nation to do good. That nation turns against God. God turns against the blessing. Reminds you of in the old law, we're talking about the mountain of blessing and the mountain of cursing. If you do this, you'll live. If you do this, you'll be destroyed. Listen to God and see the good. Listen to Psalms about that, about, oh, taste and see that the Lord is good. We have tasted and seen that the Lord is good. Don't be like the hard clay that refuses to be fashioned and formed. Be like the clay that's easily able to form. You'll hear me say that over and over again because I want that to stick into your mind. I want you to get that. If you don't get anything else, get that. And that's what it says now. So now then, speak to the men of Judah and against the inhabitants of Jerusalem. Speak to the southern kingdom and speak to the northern kingdom. Speak to Israel as a whole. Here it is. And against the inhabitants of Jerusalem, saying, thus says Yahweh. This is what God says. This isn't what Jeremiah says. This is what God says. So here's God's message. Behold, I am forming calamity. Now God's going to take the same illustration and saying, I'm the potter, and here's what I'm making. I'm making a punishment for you. And there's a reason why he's doing that. Why is he going in the form of a calamity or punishment against you and devising a plan against you? Oh, turn back, each of you, from his evil way and do good in your ways and your deeds. In the middle of a corrupt generation of people who refuse to obey God, who listen to God, who continue to walk after idolatry, walk after the Baals, as we saw last week, and continue to do all this evil, over and over we see God saying, come back. I don't want to do this. Come back. Do right. You can do right. But what is the overarching thing that keeps happening over and over as the prophets continue to call out, to call out, and to call out? What happens? What does Israel say? What does Judah say? But they will say, it's hopeless, for we are going to follow our own plans, and each of us will act according to the stubbornness of his own evil heart. Instead of saying, okay, you're the master potter, mold me and make me after thy will while I'm yielded and still. They say, no, I will not allow you to fashion me. I will not allow you to be my potter. I'm my own potter. I want to do it my way. They're stubborn. How many of you have ever watched the movie Grizzly Adams? You remember the old John Denver played as they called him Mad Jack, and he would get frustrated with number 7. Of course, he always threatened there'd be a number 8 if number 7 kept being stubborn. It's a donkey. But it's interesting is one of the instances, the donkey was more smart than Mad Jack because he's not going into that dangerous creek that he's going to fall into. But anyway, this is a good little movie. But sometimes people can be stubborn. And this is a point of stubbornness where God has said through Jeremiah, destruction's coming. God has formed destruction against you. You need to turn back and live. Israel says, no, we won't. This is God's own people. The same people that should be taught the law, should be reminded of how God delivered them out of Egypt, out of slavery. And yet they continue to say, who cares? We're going to do what we want. Because after all, according to their mind, their way is better. How many people do that today? Our way is better. I think I do better than God. This is more pleasurable than what God could give me. Wait a minute. We read in the book of Hebrews, chapter 11, of how God, through the writer, given an illustration about the old prophets and the Hall of Fame, that they were able, they forsook the fleeting pleasure of sin. Why? Because it's temporary. That's what the text says, temporary. Because that doesn't last. God can give you what lasts through eternity. Here's a thought, and might develop for another lesson. How often do you consider eternity? How often does that factor in decisions you make and how you live? I can't remember it's in Ecclesiastes, but it says that God has set eternity in their heart. There's something more than this life. There's something more, and it's eternal. And God reveals what that something more is. But notice this now, as the people continue to resist the potter. Therefore, thus says Yahweh, ask now among the nations, who ever heard the like of this? There would come, in other words, there would come a destruction upon the city of Jerusalem and upon the nation of Israel that perhaps hadn't ever came until that point in time. In other words, this is going to be well known. This is going to be something it's going to be no little thing. This is going to be something that's going to be rememberable. Whoever heard the like of this? The virgin of Israel has done a most appalling thing. Whoever thought, not only this, whoever thought the like of Israel saying to the potter, I'm going to refuse to bow to your will. The stubbornness, this type of stubbornness, has anybody ever seen something like that? But that's what Israel was. To their own God. The one that promised blessing and the fruit of the land as part of the blessing of the old law. But their own stubborn heart says, nope. I don't want God's blessing. So God says, does the snow of Lebanon forsake the rock of the open country? Or is the cold flowing water from a strange land ever uprooted? For my people have forgotten me. How many times do people remember God? How many times how many of you, don't you have to raise your hand, have you ever been to a restaurant? Have you ever observed people? Now don't be crazy and just stare and look at people. But ever, as you observe, how many people do you see bow their heads before they eat? How many people think about God before they make decisions today? Or think about God before they say things they say? Where is God? They have forgotten Him. Same way of Israel. The same people that's supposed to be God's covenant people. God says they have forgotten me. They don't know me. They're walking after their own gods. Themselves are gods to them. They're walking after their own evil, stubborn heart. They burn incense to worthless gods. They serve those idols that can do nothing. It's like if I would bow down and worship at this table here. That's a wooden structure that can do nothing for me. Man created that, but yet something like that would be something Israel would want to serve. Something that they created that didn't create them. They burn incense to worthless gods, and they have stumbled from their ways, from the ancient paths to walk in bypass. Instead of walking the narrow way, they've turned to the different way. They're walking the bypass. They're walking down. They're walking down the road, the broad way, as Jesus would describe it. The broad way that leads to destruction. They're walking on the bypath. You might hear the term seek and ask for the old path. Return. Go back to God's highway. Don't take the exit mark, do what I want to do. Continue on God's highway. It's going to lead to eternal life. All the byway is going to lead us to destruction, to a dead end. It's not going to lead to God. To walk and bypass, not on the highway, to make their land an object of horror. You think people would look at the land of Israel whenever God brought destruction upon it, and they would see that and say, look at that. What a desolation. What a stench. All those dead bodies over there. All the dead men's bones that are scattered everywhere. What a horrible sight. That's why God would make them. Because of their stubborn, evil heart. And those that live would be gone into captivity. But we also have to remember that the righteous remnant is in this too. And God would bring them out 70 years later to rebuild Jerusalem. And that's the book of Nehemiah. And nonetheless, it says to make their land an object of horror, an object of perpetual hissing. Everyone who passes by it will be horrified and shake his head. How many of you ever walked by something and something so appalling or so wrong that you just shook your head? That's the way people look at Jerusalem after they've been taken into captivity. The nations will look at it and say, what a ruinous place. And who would be blamed for that? Not God. The stubbornness of their own evil heart. The people's evil heart. God says, this is what I'm going to do to your city. This is what I'm going to do for you. You're going into captivity. That's what Jeremiah would tell them. Like an east wind, I will scatter them. This is what God says. Like an east wind, I will scatter them. While it may be Babylon and Assyria that comes in and takes over the land of the northern kingdom and the southern kingdom, it's God using those nations to do so. While at the same time, not relenting his punishment upon those nations because Babylon fell too. Medo-Persia. And then the Medo-Persians fell to the Greek. And then the Greek Empire, you had the days of the Roman kings, which in the days of those kings, the God of heaven set up his kingdom. That's the church. Daniel chapter 2. But nonetheless, that's the prophecy of the church. But anyway, it says, I will scatter them before the enemy. I will show them my back and not my face in the day of their disaster. When God turns his back, it's never good. God says, whenever they come, whenever I send them, whenever they come to take you, I'm turning my back. In other words, you're not in favor with me anymore. You're going into captivity, and I'm not going to do anything to stop them. That's why he's giving them that ultimatum. You need to change, because when this happens, I'm turning my back to you. But he wouldn't remain there, by the way, because 70 years later, here comes rebuilding. But they could have avoided all of that disaster if they just listened to God. If they just allowed God to be their potter and them to be his clay. Instead, they didn't want it. And it's sad as you read this. No wonder why we see Jeremiah as the weeping prophet. He's trying to tell people, his own family and people that he knows and loves, his own nation. And yet everybody tells him no. No, we're going to do it our own heart. In fact, it would give his life. Challenge. Here we go. Verses 18 and 23. The prophet is attacked, yet God sees. Then they said, what did the people say to Jeremiah? Oh, we're going to heed the message, Jeremiah. You provide us some. We need to listen to God because we don't want to face this. Is that what they say? Is that what happens? Remember what God said? They're not going to listen to you, Jeremiah. What did he say in a couple verses ago in I think it's verse 11, verse 12. God tells Jeremiah, here's my message, but here's what they're going to say. They're not going to listen to it, Jeremiah. Here's verse 18. Then they said, come and let us devise plans against Jeremiah. Surely the law is not going to perish from the priest. Remember a couple Sundays ago we talked about the temple? We got the temple. We got the priests. We got the priesthood here. God's not going to destroy us because we've got it here. They were deceived. Their priests were not being shepherds. They were, as Ezekiel claimed, they were shepherding themselves and not the flock. And so here's what they say to Jeremiah. Surely the law is not going to perish from the priest, nor counsel to the wise man, nor the divine word to the prophet. God's not going to cease his inspiration. He's not going to stop talking. We're not going into captivity. Come and let us strike at him with our tongue, and let us give no heed to any of his words. Exactly as God told Jeremiah. Here's a question, by the way, as you study this. How many of you ever read this and say, well, why did God through Jeremiah tell them anyway, knowing they were not going to heed his words? God's long-suffering. God knew what they would do, yet he still extended his arm. He still gave them the warning. That's why in the book of Romans we find that man is without excuse. They can't say to God, God, you didn't warn us about this. Case in point, Jeremiah. And God lists all the prophets that he sent to them. Every single one. And God could tell them, don't you tell me you didn't have a warning. Don't you tell me that I wasn't long-suffering. Don't you tell me that I didn't give you an opportunity. I gave you opportunity after opportunity after opportunity. But yet you said, we're going to do what we want to do. And God says, I'm going to do what I have to do. And that's why he disciplined his children. But notice the word, and it says, and notice what Jeremiah cries out in the midst of this. As they're devising a plan against Jeremiah, here's a thought, and here's something to look for in the New Testament. I challenge you to go and read the passages all in the New Testament where Jesus was threatened with death. Jeremiah is like Jesus here. All he's doing is giving God's message. What do the people do? They seek to destroy him. They seek to speak against him. They seek to deny the message. And so Jeremiah is going to now petition to God. He says, do give heed to me, O Yahweh, and listen to the voice of those who contend against me. Should good be repaid with evil? For they have dug a pit for me. Remember Jacob? Or is it Joseph? No, it's Joseph. Who was sold into slavery, who his own brothers had dug the pit, or had thrown him into the pit, and then finally they were convinced to sell him into slavery. And they went off and they devised that evil plan to say he was dead, and they showed that bloody coat, but he ended up being alive. Nothing different. They dug a trap for me. They dug a pit for me. Remember how I stood before you to speak good on their behalf, so as to turn away from your wrath from them. I interceded for them, God. Therefore give their children over to famine, and deliver them up to the power of the sword, and let their wives become childless and widowed. Let their men also be smitten to death, their young men struck down by the sword in battle. May an outcry be heard from their houses when you suddenly bring raiders upon them, for they have dug a pit to capture me, and hidden snares for my feet. Yet you, O Yahweh, know all their deadly counsel against me. Do not atone for their iniquity, or blot out their sin from before you. But may they be overthrown before you. Deal with them in the time of your anger. What is Jeremiah seeking? He says, I want justice for this. Here I am, I'm delivering your word, and here they're coming against me, threatening me. God says, do whatever you need to, God. And he gives some strong words, some strong things. Does God answer Jeremiah? By the way, we learned something here. Does God hear us whenever we have cries of justice, whenever we're wronged? Notice how Jeremiah dealt with this too, by the way. Could Jeremiah have fought physically at that point? Of course, he would have been probably devoured and killed. He could have. But he takes it to God. He goes to God with it. He said, God, I know that you know this is happening. And God's going to answer his prayer. Jeremiah chapter 19, he's coming back to the clay pot. Here we go. Thus says Yahweh, go and buy a potter's earthenware jar. I don't know if, I doubt this might have looked like the one he would purchase. By the way, we're not offering another collection, so don't worry about that. But he says, go buy another jar. And I want you to take some of the elders. I want you to take elders with you. Take some of the elders of the people and some of the elders of the priests. Then go out to the valley of Ben Hinnom, which is by the entrance to the potsherd gate, and there call out the words that I tell you. Again, he's told to go, and he's going to deliver what God says. And God's going to give him the message. So he goes to the valley of Ben Hinnom. In other words, it's the dung, at the top of the gate here, it's the dung gate. Or possibly the fountain gate. Potter's field was near there. You might look at Matthew chapter 27, verse 7, in reference to that. And here it is. Here's the message, verse 3. And say, hear the word of Yahweh, O kings of Judah, and inhabitants of Jerusalem. Thus says Yahweh of hosts, the God of Israel. Behold, I am about to bring a calamity upon this place, at which the ears of everyone that hears of it will tingle. Because they, and again, God does not punish or warn without a reason. Here's the reason. It's openly. Because they have forsaken me. It's not because of God. It's because of their own stubborn, evil heart and refusing to listen to God and obeying God. And have made this a foreign place and have burned incense in it to other gods. That's what they were doing in the temple. It was supposed to be the place of God. But instead they were doing that for other gods that neither they nor their fathers nor the kings of Judah had ever known. And because they have filled this place with the blood of the innocent, and have built the high places of Baal to burn their sons in the fire. That's how far their stubborn, evil heart went with their idolatry, to kill their own children as a sacrifice for a false god, which the living, loving, and heavenly God never asked for. That's sick. A thing, and notice this, a thing which I never commanded or spoke of, nor did it ever come upon my heart. It's never my plan as the God of heaven for you to kill your children as a sacrifice for me. That's not me. That's not the God of heaven. Right. Therefore, behold, days are coming. It's coming. You better listen up. That's what he's telling them. When this place will no longer be called Topheth or the valley of Ben Hinnom, but rather the valley of slaughter. The valley of slaughter. The Hinnom Valley. The Hebrew word, by the way, for drum is toph. So Topheth was a place where drums were being beaten loudly during their frenzied child sacrifices. Boom, 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 and that's how sick they became. God says, I will empty out the counsel of Judah and Jerusalem to the point of destruction in this place. I will cause them to fall by the sword. Did Jeremiah pray? And God says, yeah, it's coming. It's coming. They're going to fall by the sword for their enemies and by the hand of those who seek their life. And I will give over their carcasses as food for the birds of the sky and the beasts of the earth. I will also make this city an object of horror and of hissing. Everyone who passes by it will be horrified and hiss because of all its slaughtering. I will make them eat the flesh of their sons and the flesh of their daughters, and they will eat one another's flesh in the siege and in distress with which their enemies and those who seek their life will distress them. Then God tells Jeremiah, then you are to break the jar in the sight of men who accompany you. And I'm not going to break this jar here this morning, but can you imagine, boom, that jar is smashed as an object lesson that they would see. And God says, you smash it. You smash that jar. Break it inside the side of the men that accompany you, and you shall say to them, thus says Yahweh of hosts, just so I will break this people in this city as he did the jar. You see that broken jar, people? Israel? That's exactly what God's going to do to you. Why? Because of your stubborn, evil heart. Right. God is being loving. He's warning them of what's coming in hopes and pleading with the people to turn their ways. Over and over he said, change your way. I will break this city even as one breaks a potter's vessel which cannot again be repaired. And they will bury in Topheth because there was no other place for burial. It would be known as the place of refuge, not refuge, but refuse, garbage, trash, death, stink. In other words, how many of you have ever been to a garbage dump? Is that a lovely smell? That's what sin smells like to God. Utter garbage. That's not a place that we want to go. That's not a place that we want to go for vacation. Where are you going to vacation this week? I'm going to the garbage dump. You don't hear anybody say that. That's exactly what Jerusalem would look like in 586 BC. Like a garbage dump. But only instead of just garbage, it's going to be death and bodies and all sorts of other things that make an evil, ungodly stench. All because the people said, instead of saying, I want to be your clay, God, they said, no, I want to be the clay of this false, fake idol. And do whatever I want because it appeases me. This is what I will do to this place and its inhabitants, declares Yahweh, so as this city like Topheth. And the houses of Jerusalem and the houses of the kings of Judah will be defiled like the place of Topheth, because of all the houses on whose rooftops they burned incense to all the heavenly host and poured out drink offerings to other gods. Then Jeremiah came from Topheth, where Yahweh had sent him to prophesy, and he stood in the court of the house of Yahweh and said to all the people, Thus says Yahweh of hosts, the God of Israel, Behold, I am about to bring on this city and all its towns and the entire calamity that I have spoken against it, because they have stiffened their necks so as not to hear my words. Over and over and over again, God warns his children. He's warning them as a father does to his children. I don't want to punish you. I want to give you good. I want to do what's right, but yet you continue to rebel against me. To the point to where God, as the loving Heavenly Father, says, I've got no choice but to act. I've got no choice but to discipline you, because you refuse to hold me as your God. You refuse to give me your heart. You refuse to be like that clay on the potter's wheel, to be allowed to be molded. So here's the question for us this morning. Are we allowing God as the potter to mold us like clay? Or are we going to stiffen our necks and say, I'm my own man. I can do whatever I want to. God, you can't tell me what to do, because I want to do what my heart desires. God says, go ahead, pick that. I'll let you. But I'm about to bring punishment on you. Only the punishment God now calls for is not a temporary punishment. It's eternal. We either right now decide that we're going to allow ourselves to be like clay and be molded by God, or God's going to mold destruction for us. Which are we going to choose? Are we going to heed the warning? Or are we going to let God have his way? Or are we going to be like the stubborn children of Israel? The choice is before you as we come together, or stand together as we encourage one another.